Asus showed us their ROG Z11 case at CES this year, 9 or so months ago, and at the time I thought it looked quite large. It's only now I appreciate just how large it is, because this is a Mini-ITX case. I'll let that sink in for a second or two. ITX. And also DTX, because, you know, it's Asus and DTX is their thing. I can show you how bizarre that statement is by bringing in a small ATX case. This is the Cougar MX410 I've got in my stack of things to get reviewed in the nearish future. It's a cheap mid-tower ATX chassis. Just look at it. It's smaller, in fact, than this ITX chassis, I think. This Z11, or Z11 if you're American, but this Z11, it's a strange thing to behold. The Z11 can be stood upright, so that's the bottom, this is the top, that's the front, or it can be laid down, which now means it's quite lengthy, but not so tall. So the front I/O panel is now on the top, and the air flows, let me get this right, in at the front, I think. We'll see when we go inside. In at the front, out at the back. We'll show you inside in just a second. But before I show you inside, the price. It's £239.99, and that's a lot. The fact Asus has included this ROG 7 doll, the fact they've included this non-UK for definitely Oriental markets freebie for reviewers, that is not going to sway my opinion one jot. A £240 bizarrely large ITX/DTX chassis. There's going to be a lot we're going to have to take a close look at here. As we head towards the main event in this review, which is the triple peel, do please make sure you've subscribed to Kit Guru Tech. And if you're enjoying this video, why not hit the bell button? And 3. With the plastic removed, you get a better look at the case, and it looks smart. Unusual, but smart. To get inside, we remove that top panel, and that gives us access to these screws, 2 on either side, that secure the side panels. They're regular Phillips, but Asus includes a screwdriver in the accessory kit. Lift up and away. These ball fixtures insert in those points there and then drop down to lock it all in place. And we repeat on the other side. This panel appears to be a single sheet of machined aluminium. You can see there we've got some mesh for airflow, but not a lot of airflow. In board of those intake holes we have a small filter. If we move to the bottom of the chassis, we have another of these removable plates. The top and the bottom plates are essentially identical, except the bottom has these 4 rubber pads, obviously for the case to stand on. So that is the bottom, that is the top, but the same hardware, the same concept. And now we can see on the bottom we have a 140 intake fan. If I stand it up, I guess it's going to essentially rest on that fan. And on the top we have 2 140 exhaust fans. In the accessory pack we have a short power supply pass-through cable. That is an adapter plate for that intake fan, so you can put a 120 rad on the 140 fan down the bottom. That is a mounting plate for the likes of a water pump. An adapter plate to change from ATX power to SFX, piece of foam, and a bag of fixtures. Let us dig further inside the case and remove this back panel. Back because it's currently stood upright. Obviously if it's laid down it would be the bottom, so let's not even go there. We dive inside the case, we locate this secret thumb screw, we remove the secret thumb screw. which has just dropped somewhere. Oh god. We'll find it in a moment. And we pull the panel, which comes loose like that, and there's the thumb screw. Now we can see what we're doing. We have an ATX power supply mount at the rear. We can remove that to insert the power supply. If we choose, we can swap it out for this SFX power supply mount. With the case upright, this plate, which will light up, has the Asus ROG logo in the correct orientation. If you lay the case down, it's wrong. So Asus supplies you with an optional plate so you can swap it out depending on your orientation, so to speak. You might be wondering, why has Asus put this jaunty piece of metal in the middle of the case? Yes, it has an Asus ROG logo on it stamped in, but what does it do? For one thing, it can carry a 2.5-inch SSD, or I suppose a hard drive. For another, Asus has at least one accessory that could go on there. But the thing is, on the back of this mount, we have this, and that's really what it's all about. This is a fan RGB hub. We have two USB connections there. We have a USB cable connecting there, which goes to your motherboard. You can connect, for example, an all-in-one to one of these ports and connect the front panel header to the other, and then you can connect your fans to this PWM hub here and your RGB over here. And one of the cables in the bundle is a PWM connection, so that goes to your motherboard, and that means that these fan connections all become PWM, all doing the same thing, which is particularly important with ITX because of course ITX boards typically have very few fan headers, so the idea you can expand to 6 plus whatever else your board has, that's very useful. So we have this fan RGB hub on the back of that mount and that plate on the front. With the plate out of the way, we've got better access to the top of the power supply shroud. And if I now take this pump bracket and there we go. Water cooling aficionados can put a pump reservoir on there for their custom loop. Remove 3 more screws, 2 from the bottom and that fella there. And we can pull out that piece of bracketry, which gives us better access to the fan at the bottom of the case. The main power supply shroud is riveted in position, so that is going nowhere. We now have the option of putting this radiator bracket on that intake fan. However, that is not the main position for cooling. The bottom position is usable, but to my mind you're going to be putting the power supply there, which means that this compartment is pretty much taken up with cables. We have the intake fan at the bottom, we have the exhaust fans in the roof. Where does the CPU cooler go? Assuming you're using a 120 or a 240 all-in-one, probably a 240 realistically, it goes here at the back of the case. And the graphics card, it goes in the front. So this 240 at the rear, what's that all about? Well, we have one fan mount there, but here we have a drive plate. Let's just remove that. And now we can install a 240 all-in-one in the back of the case. So it's all beginning to make a bit more sense, apart from that business of a graphics card that's potentially up against the front glass. That is peculiar. One final feature before we get on with the build is the motherboard tray. I referred to this at CES because it's inclined at an angle, as I recall, of 11 degrees from this plane here. It's tipped forward, as you can see if you come around the back. Because it's inclined, we've got that much depth at that side and essentially but a few mil on this side, which means that we have quite a decent area here where we can pack away some cables behind the motherboard tray. But inside the main chamber, it's now looking relatively conventional, as I say, apart from that front panel. So it's steel construction, and then it's clad in some fairly attractive panels, top, bottom, and in particular that main side panel, which is aluminium. So that's the features covered. It's now time to put some hardware inside. The motherboard assembly consists of a Gigabyte Z490i Aorus Ultra motherboard with a Core i9-10900KF processor and 32GB of Corsair DDR4 3600MHz Vengeance LPX memory. Things looked straightforward when we installed the EKWB Magnitude CPU block, and then we put the motherboard in the case and realised it's all rotated 90 degrees. So off with the block, rotate 90, reinstall. Not difficult, but slightly annoying. The EK branding had to look just so after all. Power supply is a Corsair SF600, which is SFX. Although it's a small power supply, it still takes up most of the space that is available. And in pride of place at the front of the case, we have a Palette Gaming Pro GeForce RTX 3080 with the latest Alpha Cool water block. In the rear of the case, we have an EK Coolstream 240mm radiator with a pair of 120mm EK Vada RGB fans. Pump reservoir is an EK 100 DDC MX PWM. That's the build complete, and for coolant I'm going to use EK Cryofuel Solid in Scarlet because red and black are Asus ROG colours. So here we go. I think we can safely hook up a monitor, set the fan curve, and then proceed with thermal testing. And now it looks like a PC. I'm going to have to get on and do some thermal testing. I genuinely have no clue how well it's going to perform at the moment. It had better be good. An ITX case this size and this expensive has to deliver on all fronts, including thermals. And I really want to find out whether that inclined motherboard makes the blindest bit of difference or not. I tested the Z11 in 4 configurations, with the case stood upright, fans at 50% and 100%, and with the case laid down, fans at 50% and 100%. First, there's the question of noise levels. With the fans fixed at 50% of their maximum speed, the noise levels are perfectly reasonable, 46 decibels both at the front and the side of the case. With the fans running at 100%, the Z11 is noisy, and the noise meter reading is 50 decibels at 1 meter, both from the front and from the side. And then we get on to the matter of thermals. So I'm using TimeSpy's stress test, which is mainly graphics, but also tests the CPU. There's one CPU element, and I'm taking the CPU temperature from that part of it. So this is a peak CPU temperature rather than average. It's analogous to gaming. And the thermals are just bizarre. There's no doubt in my mind this case is best used upright rather than horizontal, but fan speed also plays a significant part. So if you ramp the fans up to 100%, the cooling in the vertical position is not bad. The snag is, as you heard, noise levels pretty much unacceptable, and that's a problem. If you slow the fans down, the temperatures, depending on your views on the matter, are either bad or okay. Obviously I'm using high-end hardware. If you use lesser hardware, it'll be a different story. But with this configuration, the temperatures, they're just strange. And you have to bear in mind that while we're dealing with about 420, 430 watts at the wall socket, it's quite a juicy PC. Nonetheless, we have given the Z11 the best chance because our graphics card is liquid cooled. So there's no question about this front panel choking the airflow to the graphics card. It doesn't have to draw it in up at the front and then work it out. All the cooling is coming in at the bottom and going vertically, but of course the radiator is at the back. When you take a close look at that graphic from Asus that shows the airflow and then shows how you install the cooling, you'll realise that looks a bit peculiar. The airflow goes vertically and yet you stick the cooling at the back, so actually you're asking the air to turn 90 degrees and vanish out of the back. With our chosen test PC, the combination of thermals and noise levels is okay, but we're not the least bit surprised that some other reviewers have found their graphics card has choked horribly and sits there making an infernal noise at all times. That comes as no surprise whatsoever. If you're intending to buy yourself an Asus ROG Z11, you are going to have the graphics card at the front. It is a feature, therefore liquid cooling, to our mind, is the way to go. Other aspects of the Z11 that are peculiar. Cables coming out of the rear. Because the motherboard's rotated 90 degrees, the rear I/O is on the top rather than the back. However, you've got the fans at the top, so you're not feeding cables directly out the top. They're kind of going around 90 degrees, coming out through this little opening in the back panel, and then you connect them to your monitor, your mouse, keyboard, or whatever. When I was unpacking the accessories, I wondered what this little pass-through cable was about. It's not technically a pass-through, it's an adapter. The idea is that if you're laying the case down flat, you have to disconnect the power cord, plug in this little adapter to move it around 90 degrees, and then you connect the power cord. Thus, while this works perfectly well, it shows that at every turn Asus is having to deal with problems frankly of their own making. Around the back we have a few issues. The idea of the incline motherboard tray is that the cables go on this side of the tray. There are hook and loop straps ready for the job. That's where the space is, and yet the cables in this build, they naturally lend themselves to coming over this side, which is not good. You have to kind of crush them in because there isn't much space. It would have been possible to route some of the cables over that side. It did not seem possible to route them all over there. Therefore, the incline motherboard tray, fairly pointless. Simply having a regular tray moved in 5mm that way would have made all the difference. 10mm would have been a delight. As it is, it looks different, but it doesn't work any better. The RGB, you may have noticed the two VADA RGB fans in the rear of the case were not RGB, and the reason is I don't have enough RGB connections. I've added in a couple of RGB splitters, and the one I connected up to those two RGB fans didn't want to behave, which is no indictment of anybody really. It's just a sign of having too many RGB connections, and an ITX motherboard with one ARGB connection and one 12 volt, and I was using ARGB rather than 12 volt. Mini-ITX, the idea you're going to have two RGB, not very likely. And that takes us back almost to the inherent issue with Mini-ITX, which is that you're limited. I appreciate that the RGB is down to me. I've got an RGB GPU block from AlphaCool, I've got an RGB CPU block from EK. The pump res does not have lighting in, but it could have. So the fact I've got RGB in two of those components, and I wanted RGB in my rear fans as well, along with the RGB that's built into the Z11 case, yeah, that's down to me, but I don't think it's unreasonable. And the RGB connection side of things, I was let down. I think we can safely say that we're done with the Asus ROG Z11. It's an unusual case, it's an interesting case, it's nicely built. The steel core construction is adorned with various aluminium panels that look perfectly pleasant. It's fully filtered, you've got a decent amount of glass going on. Visually, yeah, I actually quite like it. Building into it, it's not terrible. It's relatively hard work because it's so unusual, but it's not particularly difficult, and the finished result is pleasing. But also it is Mini-ITX and yet huge. The airflow is strange, potentially it's going to be blooming noisy, and undoubtedly it's going to be expensive. There is simply no getting around that. If you're prepared to accept those issues, then perhaps you should consider buying this case. But when it comes to Mini-ITX, I much prefer something significantly smaller and more compact.